You're in the OR, the plan is up on the screen, the trays are open, and you call for the implant, but it doesn't quite fit. Maybe it's too proud, maybe it doesn't sit flush, maybe it just feels off. So like every good surgeon, you adapt. You ream a bit deeper, try the next size down, shift your angle, adjust rotation, make it work. Not because that was the plan, but because that was the only option. It's not a surprise. It's not a failure. It's just expected. The system has normalized approximation, and surgeons have been asked to close the gap. Not because it's optimal, but because it's what's available. In episode 1, we looked back at how trays, templates, and average-based design became the global standard. Today, we're looking forward at what the standard actually costs, not just in dollars, though we'll get there, but in time, in alignment, in consistency, in outcomes. Because close enough might get you through the case, but what happens when it follows the patient home? This is Unstandardized, built for one. Episode 2, the cost of approximation. Let's get into it. Before the incision is made, before the scrub nurse opens the tray, before the saw ever touches bone, a plan already exists. A simulation, a digital map, a pre-op strategy designed to guide what comes next. It looks exact. It feels surgical. Angles, offsets, cut depths, screw lengths, alignment targets. And for many surgeons, it's become essential. You can rotate the model, toggle between views, load in implant options, and see exactly how a base plate will sit on a glenoid that hasn't even been touched yet. You can run trial alignments, optimize fixation, adjust resection levels, and still make it to clinic by 9 a.m. The plan doesn't just feel detailed, it feels decisive. But the OR isn't a simulation, and the patient isn't a model. Once the case begins, real-world factors start piling in. You realize the exposure is tighter than expected, the landmarks aren't exactly where they looked on the scan, the base plate doesn't sit flush. The version isn't quite right. The trial feels off. So you adjust. You translate the part, tilt the tray, choose a different screw, call for the next size up or the next size down. You abandon the original cut. You go by feel. You pivot, you adapt, and the case moves forward. But if the plan was perfect, why did it fall apart the moment we tried to use it? The answer to this lies in what we're actually planning towards. Most preoperative plans, even the most detailed 3D simulations, aren't building from a blank slate. They're snapping the patient's anatomy to preset library. They're reverse engineering the strategy based on what's already in the tray. That means we're not designing the case from first principles. We're selecting the closest available match and hoping it fits well. The system calls it templating, but in practice, it's rounding, approximating, making the best of what we have instead of giving surgeons what they need. So, when things don't sit right, when the angles feel off, when the implant floats a few millimeters proud, it's not a surprise. It's a byproduct of a system built around the average. The plan didn't fail. It never was built to succeed with the precision in the first place. We like to think of deviation as rare, as a blip, a backup plan, the case that didn't go quite right. But what if it's not the exception? What if deviation is in the workflow? Because approximation doesn't start in the OR. It starts in the plan. Templating is meant to bring clarity, to predict size, position, alignment, but more often than not, it misses. A study in total hips showed that templating predicted the correct stem size only about 52% of the time. For acetabular cup, just 51%. So we try the next size, then the next, and we hope one fits better than the rest. But hope has a cost. Every new size means a new adjustment, a new pause, a new decision point, and the more we deviate from the plan, the more pressure we place on the surgical team. More trays get opened, more options are considered mid-case. More decisions have to be made on the fly. And with every tray, every backup, every deviation, the cognitive load rises. Turnover slows, the risk of error increases, not because the team isn't prepared, but because the plan never accounted for this much improvisation. So, we step into the OR, the plan is in hand, the tray is open, and the first size doesn't fit. So we pivot. We swap trays, recheck angles, cut again. This isn't rare. One study found that nearly 40% of templated cases required an unplanned component change. That's not a backup plan, that is the plan. And when forced to choose for total knee replacements, many surgeons go smaller, not because it's optimal, but because oversizing risks overhang. Undersizing, it fits more often, even if it compromises fixation. In fact, a 2023 meta-analysis found nearly 15% of tibial base plates were undersized, another 6% were oversized. These aren't careless decisions. They are calculated trade-offs made in real time with imperfect tools. But those trade-offs have consequences. Undersized implants lead to more micromotion. More micromotion leads to early loosening, and loosening leads to revisions. And the cascade doesn't stop once the implants are in. Do you recut, adjust soft tissue, accept good enough? Because surgeons are adaptable, they pivot, they make it work. But they shouldn't have to. Every mid-op tray swap, every hesitation, every unplanned recut adds time, pressure, and risk. And over thousands of cases, that risk compounds. We lose bone, we drift from optimal alignment, we create stress points the body has to absorb. Not because the surgeon failed, but because the tray didn't have what the patient needed. So yes, these aren't mistakes, they're contingencies. But zoom out and the pattern is clear. We're asking surgeons to patch the system again and again and call it success. The cost of approximation doesn't stop in the OR. As I said, it follows the patient home. Because when an implant doesn't match the bone, the body doesn't just shrug it off. It adapts, it inflames, it breaks down. Let's start with rotation, one of the most subtle and more common challenges. One study found that 27% of femoral components were placed in internal rotation, a figure that reflects more than just a technical error. Sometimes it's a byproduct of bony asymmetry, surgical trade-offs, and the limits of standardized trays. And that fit, it comes with consequences. Just 3 degrees of internal rotation can trigger patellomaltracking, anterior knee pain, and stiffness. Up to 50% of revisions for stiffness trace back to this single factor. And it's not rare, it's just hard to see. CT-based studies show nearly 30% of painful TKAs involved in rotational error, often invisible on plain radiographs. In one study, the painful group averaged negative 1.9 degrees of femoral rotation. The control group, just positive 0.2 degrees, a tiny angle, massive difference. Today, it's the third most common technical reason for early revision, right behind infection and loosening. And even when we pick the right size, we're still only approximating, because most off-the-shelf implants scale by size, not shape. But anatomy doesn't work like that. The geometry of the knee, the condyles, the trochlear groove, the flexion arcs, they're all unique. So even if the implant fits, it doesn't restore the joint's natural structure. And when the shape is wrong, balance gets harder, soft tissue respond differently, function feels off. That's why shape matters just as much as size, and why real personalization, shape-matched, patient-specific implants could change everything. But we'll save that for episode 5. Right now, we stay in the OR, because even when surgeons do everything right with what they've got, bone is still the first thing we lose. The implant won't sit, resect more bone. The joint won't balance, resect more bone. Not because anyone wants to, but because there's no other choice, and the resection has a cost. Bone is precious. Every millimeter matters, especially if the patient ever needs a revision. And revisions are rising fast. Everyone knows these numbers, but I'll say them for the record. Up to 20% of patients still report persistent knee pain after a TKA, and 10 to 15% say they're overall dissatisfied with the outcome. Not because the surgery went wrong, but because the system did what it always does. It approximated, but for them, the body noticed. The body isn't the only one paying for it, though, because the cost of approximation, it's financial too. Start with trays. Every tray brought in, just in case, costs $30 to $80 to sterilize, handle, and reprocess. Most surgeons open 4 or 6, maybe 8 trays per procedure, and 30 to 60% of those instruments are never touched. Multiply that across nearly 1 million total knees a year in the US, and you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in waste. And that's just for primaries. Now scale it to revisions. Revision knees cost 61% more than a primary procedure, but receive just 24% more in reimbursement. The average revision, nearly $70,000. If it's septic, add another $35,000. OR times double, hospital stays extend, specialized teams are needed, and the margins for the hospitals often negative. And it's not slowing down. By the early 2030s, revision TKAs are projected to rise by over 600%. But here's the part that stings. A huge chunk of those costs could be prevented just by getting it right the first time. We spend billions fixing what precision could have prevented, and somehow the system still finds it easier to pay for potential failure rather than reward for a higher chance of getting it right. We've known the problems for years. We know approximation leads to inefficiencies, revisions, and rising costs. And we know, at least in theory, that personalization could fix a lot of it. So the question is obvious. Why hasn't precision replaced approximation? And the answer isn't technology. It's the system. Because even when better tools exist, the environment isn't built to support them. Reimbursement still rewards volume over value. There's no CPT code for getting the size right the first time. No DRG bonus for reducing revisions by improving the initial fit. In many cases, precision is treated like luxury and not a necessity, and regulation hasn't caught up either. Most policies are written around mass-produced devices, not one-off optimizations. And then there's training. Most surgeons haven't trained to expect personalization. They were taught how to work with what's available and make it work. That's not a failure. That's adaptability, and we've come to celebrate it. But precision doesn't replace surgical skill. It amplifies it. Still, the system keeps asking surgeons to close the gap, to compensate for missing options, to adjust mid-case, to resect more bone, to balance what was never designed to fit. Even robotics, which were supposed to be our leap forward, are mostly being used to place standard implants with greater accuracy. We'll dive deeper into that in episode 4. But for now, here's the point. We took a breakthrough technology and used it to stabilize standardization. Because precision isn't just about new tools, it's about intent, about building a surgical system that expects more, that sees personalization not just as niche, but as a necessity, and rewards teams for getting it right the first time. Until that happens, approximation will stay the default. Not because it's better, but because it's easier to bill, easier to scale, and easier to defend when it fails. Next time, we'll take a step back, because before we can fix surgical execution, we have to understand surgical planning. Episode 3, The Myth of the Perfect Plan, explores what happens when templating falls short, when simulations don't translate, and when even a great plan can't survive first contact with the patient. We'll talk about where planning succeeds and where it breaks down, and how to build a bridge between the strategy and execution. Because precision can't just be a pre-op concept. It has to make it to the OR. This is Unstandardized, built for one. The mission to make personalization the standard. I'll see you in episode 3.